Hi, I'm Rita G. Moran. Thank you for having me today to do this presentation that I call Hidden Human Story. The Great Pyramids of Egypt. Everybody's in awe of it, and everybody wonders how they were built. Well, I have an answer through some books today. Isis, Osiris, and Horus created a dynasty, but that wasn't the only dynasty in Egypt. In fact, these books will tell you that there were people before them. This was the other dynasty, Set, and they were in competition with the dynasty of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. He was Upper Egypt, they were Lower Egypt. Egypt has a lot of ceremonies and rituals, but where did these come from? This one is an opening of the mouth. Circumcision, a very big ceremony that was very present in ancient Egypt. But where did it come from? I'm going to tell you. It came from Cronus. There's a picture of circumcision in ancient Egypt. The Namar palette, he's thought to be the pharaoh that united both kingdoms, but not very long ago, maybe about 6,000 years ago. Some people think that he may be Menes, or he may be a descendant of Scorpion. They're not quite sure yet. So the mystery of it all. Who built the pyramids? Who were the gods and goddesses? Why the rituals of circumcision? And what happened to these gods and goddesses? And why were they always shown as tall and giant? And why are there pyramids and mounds all over the world? Well, I have the answers, and I've been studying this since I've been about 10 years old, and I found a lot of it in this library that I'm going to tell you about. In this library, and we're going to talk about it a little further, it tells you the identity of who Osiris is. This is called a book from the Loeb Library. It's out of Harvard. There's over 500 of these books. The green represent Greek scholars, and the red will represent Roman scholars. Let me read this to you from Diodorus Siculus, who was an ancient Greek scholar who lived over 2,000 years ago, who spent 30 years of his life going to ancient Egypt and getting at other places to get the history of the world, and he wrote 40 books, and only about half of them survived. And some of it is in other scholars' books, but he wrote the Library of History. So let me read this to you, what he said about who Osiris is. And of the ancient Greek writers of mythology, some give to Osiris the name Dionysus, or with a slight change in form, Sirius. One of them, Eumolpus, in his Bacchic hymn speaks of our Dionysus, shining like a star, with fiery eye in every ray. That's from the Library of History, written by a Greek scholar over 2,000 years ago. What? How come we don't know about this, right? This is only the tip of the iceberg of what's in this library. There's a lot of history in here. Dionysus was the son of Zeus. So let's reiterate that. Osiris is Dionysus. That makes Osiris the son of Zeus and Semet. So he has multiple names. So this is how we start. How did it all begin? I just want to give you a quick background of how I got into this. When I was about 10 years old, I noticed there was a lot of similarity between Mesoamerican archaeology and Egyptian archaeology. Things were just too similar. The pyramids, the concern for life after death, the rulers. And I always felt there was a connection. And as I got older, I had a mainstream job, and I eventually had kids. And when I stayed home for my kids, I began to write a children's series called The Library Kids. And this idea started when I visited a cave in Texas with my family, and then it further blossomed when I visited another cave up in Wisconsin. And what this book is about is a group of children that traveled the world to complete a mission. But throughout the 7-book series, they learn all about mythology and history. And so as I was going through and writing this 7-book series and studying mythology, I began to see a pattern that they were all telling the same story almost. Just each culture had variances and different names. And then I stumbled into this library, and it really all came together. I also began to come up with something I call the mythological unification theory. And I'm just going to state it as it is. From my research, I believe that all mythologies, including modern-day religions, are about the same group of people that actually existed over at least 15,000 years ago, who traveled the world and spread their cults of agriculture. And they were given different names and different stories in each culture. Now, there was another scholar named Valerius Maximus, and he's slightly over 2,000 years ago. This was a Roman scholar, and he wrote a book called Memorable Deeds and Sayings, 1,000 Tales from Ancient Rome. But there was something in here that really caught my eye. And he wrote, the Jews had tried to corrupt Roman values with their cult of Jupiter Sabazius, so the praetor forced them to go back to their home. I said, what? The cult of Jupiter Sabazius is Zeus. So I started to search, and I'm sorry, that's not real clear, but I found on the internet this statue at the, I think that was the Boston Art Museum, but they call it Zeus Sabazius. That book said Jupiter Sabazius. Well, Jupiter and Zeus is the same person. So I got very intrigued. And I thought, boy, that's just another piece of the puzzle coming together. So I started to really get into this Loeb Library. Now, what is the Loeb Library? The Loeb Library is a book, or a library of books out of Harvard University. It was put together by this Jewish German-American man named James Loeb. James Loeb was born to a very well-to-do banker family, and they wanted him to be in the banking industry. But he didn't want to do that. He was more interested in the classics and music. And he was in the banking industry for a while, and he got very sick. He had to get out. So he basically centered the rest of his life to put this library together. Today, this library is still expanding. Okay, so he is the one who started to put this library together of the writings of ancient Greek and Roman scholars. Here's another picture of him. And by the way, he was born in 1867. I think he died around 1930, in the 1930s. So it's just quite a while ago. So I started to look at this library because in my mind, I knew at this point that these mythologies were connected. And I was starting to see these pieces. And I started to look at the catalog of the library, and I started to look for certain books that were for a certain time period and about mythology in particular. Because there's books from Caesar and much later history. So I centered on certain scholars that I knew would tell me the story that I needed to flesh out of this library. And by the way, this isn't the only library. There's books out of the British Library, which I'll talk about later. But out of this Loeb Library, Diodorus Siculus, Valerius Maximus, Nonus, Plutarch, those are Greek scholars over 2,000 years ago. They tell the story of this family that I call the Cronides. Cronus was the father of Zeus. Zeus was the father of Dionysus Osiris. They're called the Cronides because they came from Cronus, and that's written about in here. But they're, as you're going to see later on, they're also referred to as Atlanteans in these books. Some of the other scholars that I looked at was Sanchonathan. He's a Phoenician scholar. They don't even know when this guy was around. They're thinking maybe 3,000 years ago. That came out of the British Library. He tells the story of Cronus and Uranus and the goddesses that came before them and gods. Snorri Sturluson is a Nordic writer about 800 years ago. He does a very good job of talking about the Nordic version of mythology. And I'm going to show you that Odin is also Zeus. And I'm going to show you that these people traveled all over. Some people have some issues with Snorri Sturluson. They feel that he wrote after some of the poetic Edda and may have corrupted a little bit with Christianity, but I think he did a pretty good job. And you kind of have to go back and forth on these books to try and flesh out the story. So I just want to also mention one other thing. There's multiple people with the same names as these gods. They all have a story. There will be multiple Apollos. There may be multiple Zeuses. There were two other Dionysuses before the main Dionysus, who was Osiris. But their story is written about in these books. And what happened orally is that some of these stories of all of these people combined, and the last person with that name may have inherited some of the detail of the previous people's lives. So it's not only important to know the mythology and the symbolism, you've got to have the written word to know what was really going on. And that's in this library and other libraries. And I call them esoteric because they're not really hidden, they're just not well known about. Plutarch. Okay, before I talk about who built the pyramids, there's a lot of people that feel that these pyramids had a technology to them, and they probably did. And some feel that they had magnetic and electric qualities, and they probably did. A lot of the symbolism of these gods and goddesses or people was put into these monuments, and I just want to read this from Plutarch. Moreover, they call the lodestone the bone of Horus, and iron the bone of Typhon. That would be Set, as Manetho records. For as the iron oftentimes acts as if it were being attracted and drawn toward the stone, and oftentimes is rejected and repelled in the opposite direction, in the same way the salutary and good and rational movement of the world at one time, by persuasion, attracts and draws toward itself and renders more gentle than harsh and Typhonian movement, and then again it gathers itself together and reverses it and plunges it into difficulties. That's Plutarch, Moralia, Volume 5, Isis and Osiris. Okay, lodestone is magnetic. So they understood this quality. So I wouldn't doubt that they knew what to do with this when they were using this, and symbolically or whatever they were doing with it, putting it into the design of these ancient structures. So how were these pyramids built? Well, they go into that in this Loeb library, and this is a little hard to read. I'm going to read it, and it's a little bit lengthy. It's a few pages. Okay. The 8th king Chemist of Memphis ruled 50 years and constructed the largest of the 3 pyramids, which are numbered among the 7 wonders of the world. These pyramids, which are situated on the side of Egypt, which is towards Libya, and 120 stades from Memphis and 45 from the Nile, and by the immensity of their structures and the skill shown in their execution, they fill the beholder with wonder and astonishment. For the largest is in the form of a square and has a base length on each side of 7 plethra and a height of over 6 plethra. It also gradually tapers to the top. where each side is 6 cubits long. The entire construction is of hard stone, which is difficult to work but lasts forever. For though no fewer than 1,000 years have elapsed, as they say, to our lifetime, or as some writers have it, more than 3,400, the stones remain to this day still preserving their original position and the entire structure undecayed. It is said that the stone was conveyed over a great distance from Arabia, and that the construction was effected by means of mounds, since cranes had not yet been invented at that time. And the most remarkable thing in the account is that though the constructions were on such a great scale, and the country round about them consists of nothing but sand, not a trace remains either of any mound or of the dressing of the stones, so that they do not have the appearance of being the slow handiwork of men, but look like a sudden creation, as though they had been made by some god and set down bodily in the surrounding sand. Certain Egyptians would make a marvel out of these things, saying that inasmuch as the mounds were built of salt and saltpeter, when the river was let in, it melted them down and completely effaced them without the intervention of man's hand. However, there is not a word of truth in this, but the entire material for the mounds, raised as they were by the labor of many hands, was returned by the same means to the place from which it came. For 360,000 men, as they say, were employed on the undertaking, and the whole structure was scarcely completed in 20 years. Upon the death of this king, his brother Sephron succeeded to the throne and ruled 56 years. But some say that it was not the brother of Chemist, but his son named Cabres, who took the throne. All writers, however, agree that it was the next ruler who, emulating the example of his predecessor, built the second pyramid, which was the equal of the one just mentioned in the skill displayed in its execution, but far behind it in size, since its base length on each side is only a stade. And an inscription on the larger pyramid gives the sum of money expended on it, since the writing sets forth that on vegetables and purgatives for the workmen there were paid out over 1,600 talents. The smaller bears no inscription, but has